The smoke hung in the morning air like a shroud. Li Wei stood in what used to be the town square, his shoes crunching on blackened debris. Buildings that once framed the heart of Willow Creek were now skeletal remains. The smell of char and ash filled his lungs. He knelt down and picked up a chunk of wood, still warm to the touch. Yesterday, it had been part of the general store's porch. Today, it was nothing but carbon. Li turned it over in his calloused hands, feeling its weight. Son. The word floated to him on the breeze, so soft he might have imagined it. Li looked up to see Mayor Hargrove limping toward him through the devastation. The old man's face was streaked with soot, his eyes red-rimmed from smoke and lack of sleep. But there was something else there, too. Something Li had never seen directed at him before. The mayor stood beside him now, surveying the destruction that stretched before them. His hand came to rest on Li's shoulder, firm and steady. "My son," he said again, louder this time. The words hung between them as the rising sun painted the charred landscape in gold. Willow Creek had been a typical western town 3 days ago. Main Street ran straight as an arrow, lined with false-fronted buildings weathered by decades of sun and wind. The saloon stood at one end, the church at the other, as if marking the boundaries between sin and salvation. Dust devils danced down the street on hot afternoons, and horses stamped at hitching posts outside the mercantile. Li Wei's restaurant occupied a narrow building at the edge of the square. The hand-painted sign above the door reads simply Li's Kitchen. It wasn't much to look at from outside, just weathered clapboard with a single window facing the street. Inside was a different story. The scents of ginger, garlic, and five-spice powder mingled with those of coffee and apple pie. Li had learned early that survival meant adaptation. The morning routine never varied. Li rose before dawn to stoke the fire in his coal stove. He mixed dough for the morning biscuits and set water to boil for rice. By first light, the coffee pot would be percolating, filling the small space with its rich aroma. He'd crack eggs into a bowl, slice bacon, and chop potatoes for the miners who came in for breakfast before their shift. Li had come to America 15 years ago, just a boy of 17. The railroad had brought him west, and when the tracks were laid, he found himself stranded in a land that viewed him with suspicion. Cooking had been his salvation. Everyone needed to eat, even those who wouldn't meet his eyes on the street. He'd started with a cart, then saved enough for the small building he now called both home and business. The townsfolk came for his food, but kept their distance otherwise. They called him Chinaman or just Cook, never bothering to learn his name. Children sometimes pulled at the corners of their eyes when he passed. Adults were more subtle in their disdain, but it was there in the way they placed coins on the counter rather than in his hand, and how conversations died when he entered the general store. Mayor Hargrove was different, at least in small ways. He always called Li by name and tipped his hat in greeting. Each morning, the mayor would come in for coffee and eggs, taking the same seat by the window. He'd nod his thanks when Li served him and sometimes comment on the weather or the town's business. It wasn't friendship, but it was acknowledgement, and in Willow Creek, that counted for something. Li lived in the rooms above his restaurant, sparse quarters that held few possessions. A small shrine to his ancestors stood in one corner, with incense that he lit each morning. A trunk contained letters from his family in China, carefully preserved. The walls were bare except for a calendar with Chinese characters and a charcoal sketch of the mountains visible from the town. At night, after the last customer had gone and the dishes were washed, Li would sit on his back step and look at the stars. They were the same stars that shone over his village in Guangdong province, the same lights his family saw when they looked up. In those quiet moments, the distance didn't seem so vast. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by the postmaster's son who looked uncomfortable standing in Li's doorway. The envelope bore the town seal, and inside was a single sheet of paper with the mayor's formal letterhead. Li read it twice to be sure he understood. Mr. Li Wei is cordially invited to attend the town meeting this Friday evening at 7 o'clock to discuss arrangements for the Founders' Day Festival. Your input would be valued. Respectfully, Mayor Thomas Hargrove. Li placed the letter on his counter and stared at it. In 15 years, he had never been invited to a town meeting. He had never been asked for his input on anything beyond whether a customer wanted more coffee. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. That night, he pressed his only suit, a dark wool garment he'd worn just twice before, once for his father's funeral before leaving China, and once for a wedding of a railroad worker who'd shown him kindness. The fabric was stiff with disuse, but it still fit his lean frame. He polished his shoes until they gleamed in the lamplight. Friday evening came, and Li closed his restaurant early. He combed his hair neatly and straightened his collar in the small mirror above his wash basin. The invitation sat on his table, its official seal catching the light. He folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket, a talisman against the uncertainty that churned in his stomach. The town hall stood in the center of the square, its white columns rising 2 stories high. Lanterns illuminated the steps where people gathered in small groups, their conversations creating a low hum in the evening air. Lee approached slowly, aware of the glances that followed him. A few nodded in greeting, but most turned away, puzzled by his presence. Inside, wooden benches faced a raised platform where the town council sat. The mayor occupied the center chair, his silver hair catching the lamplight. Lee took a seat at the back, perching on the edge of the bench as if ready to flee. The room filled quickly, the scent of tobacco and wool heavy in the air. Mayor Hargrove called the meeting to order with 3 raps of his gavel. "Citizens of Willow Creek," he began, his voice carrying to the rafters, "we gather tonight to discuss the upcoming Founders' Day Festival. This year marks our town's 50th anniversary, and I believe it's time we celebrate not just our founders, but all those who have contributed to making Willow Creek what it is today." The mayor's gaze swept the room, pausing briefly when it reached Lee. This town was built by people from all walks of life, from all corners of the world. The miners who came for gold, the merchants who saw opportunity, the farmers who tamed the land. Each brought their own strengths, their own traditions. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was not the usual speech about pioneers and manifest destiny. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, curious. "I propose that this year's festival include a showcase of the diverse heritage of our citizens. Food, music, crafts from the old countries. A celebration of how many streams flow into the river of our community." Lee felt a strange tightness in his chest. The mayor's words seemed directed at him, though Hargrove was addressing the entire room. For a moment, Lee allowed himself to imagine a place at the festival, perhaps serving dumplings or tea, sharing a piece of his homeland with people who had never shown interest before. The discussion that followed was heated. Some embraced the idea enthusiastically. Others objected, arguing that the festival should honor the town's American roots. Lee remained silent, listening as his neighbors revealed their thoughts about foreigners and traditions that don't belong here. As the debate grew more intense, a new tension entered the room. Reverend Miller, who had been sitting near the door, suddenly stood. "Does anyone else smell smoke?" he asked, his voice cutting through the arguments. For a moment, no one moved. Then came the sound of running feet outside, followed by shouting. The fire bell began to ring, its frantic clanging cutting through the night. People rushed to the windows. Across the square, flames licked at the roof of Anderson's feed and grain. The wooden structure, filled with hay and seed, burned fiercely, sending sparks into the dark sky. These embers drifted on the wind, landing on the dry shingles of nearby buildings. "Fire brigade!" Mayor Hargrove shouted, already moving toward the door. "Everyone to your stations." The room emptied in seconds, people streaming out into the night. Lee followed, his heart pounding. The town's volunteer fire brigade was assembling, men rushing to pull the hand-pumped engine from its shed. But Lee could see at a glance that the fire was moving too quickly. The summer had been dry, and a strong wind was blowing from the east, pushing the flames toward the heart of town. Mayor Hargrove stood in the center of the chaos, shouting orders. "Form a bucket line from the well. Get those horses out of the livery. Someone wake Doc Sanders. We'll need him." Lee watched as the first building was engulfed, then the second. The bucket brigade was fighting a losing battle, the water sizzling uselessly against the advancing inferno. Without thinking, he pushed his way through the crowd until he reached the mayor's side. "Mayor," Lee said, his voice raised above the roar of the fire. "This won't work. Fire too big for water alone." Hargrove turned, surprise registering on his face at Lee's presence. "What do you suggest, Mr. Lee?" "We're doing all we can." Lee pointed to the dry goods store. "Need salt. Lots of salt. And blankets. Wet blankets to smother flames. In my village, we fight fire this way when river is dry." The mayor hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Johnson," he called to a nearby man. "Get to the mercantile. We need all the salt they have and every blanket you can find. Move." Lee didn't wait to see if his instructions were followed. He ran to his restaurant, grabbed his largest cooking pots, and filled them with water. He added tea leaves, not for flavor, but because his grandfather had taught him that the tannins in tea helped soak fabric more thoroughly, making wet blankets hold moisture longer against the heat. By the time he returned to the square, others had brought blankets and sacks of salt. Lee showed them how to soak the blankets in the tea water, then wring them out just enough so they wouldn't drip. Cover small fires with wet blankets, he demonstrated. Throw salt on edges of big fire to slow it down. The townsfolk, desperate to save their homes, followed his lead without question. Men who had never spoken to Lee now worked alongside him, passing blankets and salt, following his shouted instructions in accented English. Women joined too, forming new bucket lines, their skirts tied up out of the way as they fought to save their town. For hours they battled the blaze. Lee's lungs burned from the smoke, and his arms ached from the endless lifting and carrying. His suit was ruined, streaked with soot and soaked with sweat and dirty water. But gradually, the tide began to turn. The fire's advance slowed, then stopped. Building by building, they brought the flames under control. Dawn found them still working, extinguishing hot spots and clearing debris. The eastern half of the town was gone, the feed store, the livery, 3 houses, and the old barn behind the mayor's home. But the rest stood, smoky and water-damaged but intact. Lee's restaurant had been spared, protected by its position at the edge of town in the direction of the wind. Lee sat on the steps of the church, too exhausted to move. His hands were blistered, his throat raw. Someone pressed a cup of water into his hands, and he drank gratefully, not looking up to see who had offered it. Mr. Lee. It was the mayor's voice. Lee raised his head to find Hargrove standing before him, his face blackened with soot, his clothes torn and singed. I believe we owe you our thanks. Your quick thinking saved what's left of our town. Lee shook his head. Everyone worked together. I just knew different way to fight fire. A way none of us knew, the mayor said. Without your knowledge, we might have lost everything. He extended his hand. Thank you. Lee looked at the offered hand for a long moment before taking it. The mayor's grip was firm, his palm as calloused as Lee's own. It was perhaps the first time anyone in Willow Creek had shaken his hand as an equal. As the sun climbed higher, people began to take stock of what remained. The injured were tended to, the homeless taken in by neighbors. Lee opened his restaurant, not to serve customers, but to provide a place where people could rest and get a hot drink. He made huge pots of rice porridge, simple food that would fill empty stomachs and require little chewing for those suffering from smoke inhalation. Mayor Hargrove established a command center in the town hall, coordinating relief efforts and beginning to plan for rebuilding. Messengers were sent to neighboring towns for supplies and assistance. The telegraph lines were down, but a rider was dispatched to the county seat to report the disaster. Late in the afternoon, as Lee was sweeping ashes from his front step, a boy came running up. Mr. Lee, he panted, the mayor wants you at his house right away. They found something in the barn ruins. Lee followed the boy through town to where the mayor's home stood. The house itself was untouched, but the barn behind it was nothing but charred timbers and ash. A group of men stood in a circle, looking down at something on the ground. Mayor Hargrove knelt in the center, carefully turning the pages of a scorched book. He looked up as Lee approached. Mr. Lee, I thought you should see this. It was my father's journal. Somehow it survived the fire. He held out the book, open to a page covered in faded handwriting. Lee hesitated. I cannot read English writing well, he admitted. Then I'll read it to you, the mayor said. He cleared his throat. April 18th, 1878. Today, I met a Chinese man named Chen who saved James from drowning in the creek. I have spoken harshly of these foreigners in the past, believing them to be a threat to our way of life. But watching this man dive into the rushing water without hesitation to save my son has shaken my certainty. He asked for nothing in return, not even thanks. I find myself questioning many things I once held as truth. The mayor turned the page. May 30th, 1878. Shan has begun teaching me words in his language. He laughs at my poor pronunciation, but never with mockery. He tells me of his family in China, of parents he hopes to bring to America someday. I see now that his dreams are not so different from my own. We are both fathers seeking a better life for our children. Lee stood very still, the words washing over him. The journal spoke of a friendship between the mayor's father, a man Lee had heard described as the town's most vocal opponent of Chinese immigration, and a fellow countryman who had somehow broken through that prejudice. There's more, Mayor Hargrove said. Many entries over the years. Chen eventually moved on to San Francisco, but they corresponded until my father's death. I had no idea. He closed the book carefully. It seems I come from a tradition of having my mind changed by brave Chinese men. That night, Lee couldn't sleep. He sat by his window, looking out at the damaged town, turning the day's events over in his mind. The fire had destroyed much, but it had also revealed things long buried, not just the journal, but the capacity of the townspeople to work together regardless of origin when facing a common threat. Morning came, and with it a knock at Lee's door. The mayor stood there, hat in hand. Mr. Lee, he said, the town council met at first light. We've made some decisions about rebuilding, and I'd like your input, if you're willing to give it. Lee invited him in, serving tea in chipped cups that had survived the chaos. The mayor spread out a rough map of the town on Lee's table. We're thinking of widening the main street when we rebuild, creating more space between buildings as a fire break, and establishing a proper water system with hydrants, not just wells. They talked for an hour, discussing practical matters of reconstruction. Lee suggested techniques from his homeland for making buildings more resistant to fire, tile roofs instead of wooden shingles, wider spacing between structures, stone walls where possible. The mayor took notes, nodding thoughtfully. As he prepared to leave, Hargrove paused at the door. There's one more thing, Mr. Lee. The council has voted to make you an official member of the fire brigade. With pay. Your knowledge is valuable to this town, and we've been fools not to recognize it sooner. Lee stared at him, speechless. The mayor continued, and the Founders' Day festival will go ahead as planned, once we've made enough progress rebuilding. I hope you'll consider sharing your cuisine as part of the celebration. I would be honored, Lee managed to say. The mayor nodded. Good. We'll start clearing debris today. I'll see you at the town square at noon. He put on his hat and turned to go, then stopped. My father's journal mentioned that his friend Shin taught him a Chinese word. Shinran. Trust, he said it meant. I think it's time we built some of that here. The rebuilding began that day. Men and women who had barely acknowledged Lee's existence now worked alongside him, clearing rubble and salvaging what could be saved. Children who had once mocked his accent now ran errands for him, bringing water and tools where needed. It wasn't perfect. There were still sideways glances and muttered comments, but it was a beginning. A week after the fire, as the framework for the first new building rose against the sky, Lee found himself working next to the mayor. They were sorting through a pile of bricks, testing each for cracks before adding it to the stack of usable materials. My son would have been about your age, the mayor said suddenly, his eyes on the brick in his hands. He died in the Great War, at Bellowwood. I received a telegram, nothing more. No body to bury, no personal effects returned. Just words on paper telling me he was gone. Lee didn't know what to say. He had seen the photograph on the wall of the mayor's office, a young man in uniform, smiling confidently at the camera. But he hadn't known the boy's fate. I think that's why your actions during the fire affected me so deeply, the mayor continued. You fought to save a town that has never truly welcomed you. That kind of selflessness. He trailed off, then placed the brick carefully on the good pile. It reminded me of him. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of their movements falling into sync. Finally, Lee spoke. In China, we believe our ancestors watch over us. Perhaps your son sees what you do now. Perhaps he is proud. The mayor's hand stilled. For a moment, Lee feared he had overstepped. Then Hargrove nodded, just once, and returned to his work. But something had shifted between them, some barrier fallen away. 3 weeks after the fire, enough progress had been made that the town held a small ceremony to mark the occasion. A new flagpole was raised in the square, and Mayor Hargrove gave a speech about resilience and community. Afterward, there was a modest feast, with everyone contributing what they could. Lee brought pots of fragrant rice and stir-fried vegetables, dishes he had never before served in his restaurant. To his surprise, people lined up for his food, asking questions about the ingredients and preparation. Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife who had always been coldly polite at best, requested his recipe for the ginger sauce. Reverend Miller invited him to speak to the Sunday school about Chinese New Year customs. As the celebration wound down, Lee found himself sitting on a newly constructed bench beside the mayor. They watched as the townspeople mingled in the square, the divisions that had once defined them less visible now. We're thinking of renaming the town festival, the mayor said. Instead of Founders' Day, perhaps Community Day would be more fitting. A celebration not just of our past, but of our present and future together. Lee nodded. A good name. And I'd like to commission a proper sign for your restaurant, Hargrove continued. Something more substantial than that painted board. Lee Wei's Kitchen, a taste of home. What do you think? Lee thought of his small restaurant, of the years spent cooking American food because he believed no one would try dishes from his homeland. He thought of the people who had lined up for his Chinese vegetables today, their curiosity overcoming old prejudices. Yes, he said. I would like that very much. The sun was setting now, painting the half-rebuilt town in gold and shadow. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges. But tonight, sitting in the square with the mayor, Lee felt something he had not experienced in 15 years in America, the sense of belonging. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect day for rebuilding. Lee rose early as always, But instead of preparing breakfast for customers, he made dumplings to share with the workers. The familiar motions of mixing dough and filling, the pleating and pinching, connected him to his past even as he looked toward a new future. As he carried the steaming basket to the town square, he saw Mayor Hargrove already there, overseeing the delivery of lumber for the new mercantile. The older man waved him over. "Mr. Lee, good morning. I have something to show you." He led Lee to his small patch of turned earth at the center of the square. Beside it stood a sapling, its roots wrapped in burlap, its slender trunk supported by stakes. A Chinese elm. The county seat had a nursery with several. "I thought it fitting for our new town center." Lee touched one of the small, serrated leaves. In China, elm symbolizes long life and protection. "A good choice. I thought we might plant it together," the mayor said. "A symbol of our new beginning." They worked side by side, digging the hole deeper, carefully positioning the young tree and tamping down the soil around its roots. Other townspeople gathered to watch, offering suggestions and encouragement. When the tree was secure, Mayor Hargrove stepped back, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the small crowd, "I present the first planting of our rebuilt town square. May it grow strong and provide shade for generations to come." He turned to Lee. "Would you do the honor of watering it for the first time?" Lee accepted the bucket offered by a young boy, the same child who had once pulled at his eyes in mockery, now watching him with respect. He poured the water slowly around the base of the sapling, making sure it reached the roots. "In my village," he said, his voice carrying in the morning stillness, "we say a tree planted by friends will never wither." He handed the bucket back to the boy. "Thank you." As the crowd dispersed to begin the day's work, Mayor Hargrove remained beside Lee. They stood in companionable silence, watching as the sun rose higher, casting their shadows beside the newly planted elm. "You know," the mayor said finally, "I meant what I said yesterday about the sign for your restaurant. But I was thinking perhaps we could expand on that idea." Lee looked at him questioningly. "The old feed store lot is available now. Larger than your current place. Room for more tables, a bigger kitchen. The town could use a proper gathering place, somewhere everyone feels welcome." He met Lee's gaze directly. "Would you consider it?" "The council would help with financing, of course." Lee stared at him, processing the offer. A larger restaurant, with the town's blessing and support. A place where he could serve both the American dishes his customers expected and the food of his homeland. A true blending of his two worlds. "I would need to think about it," he said carefully. The mayor nodded. "Of course. It's a big decision." He looked out over the half-rebuilt town, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when I called you son that morning after the fire, it wasn't just gratitude speaking. This town needs men like you, men who see beyond the surface, who bring different knowledge and perspectives. Men who act with courage when it matters most." Lee followed his gaze, seeing not just what was, but what could be. A town where difference was valued rather than feared. A community where he might truly belong, not just exist on the margins. "I will consider your offer," he said. "And I thank you for it." The mayor smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Good. Now, I believe those are dumplings I smell, and I haven't had breakfast yet. Shall we?" They walked together toward the basket Lee had set down, their shadows stretching before them in the morning light. Behind them, the elm sapling stood tall in its new home, its leaves turning gently in the breeze. As the sun climbed higher, casting its golden light across the reborn town square, Li Wei found himself thinking of cycles and seasons, of endings and beginnings. The fire had destroyed much, but from those ashes, something new was growing, not just buildings and businesses, but understanding and connection. He looked at the sapling they had planted, so small now, but with the potential to grow tall and strong. Like the tree, this new sense of belonging would need tending. There would be dry seasons and storms to weather, but its roots were taking hold in the soil of Willow Creek, and Li Wei, for the first time in 15 years, felt truly at home.